Story 5, A Meeting of the Shadows. Part 1, The Pacts of Violence. The air in the Crescent Club was thick, a swirling haze of smoke drifting lazily from cigars and cigarettes, curling upward into the dimly lit room. The strains of a saxophone wove through the clinking of glasses and low murmurs of conversation, setting a mood that was both sultry and tense. The bartenders moved with precision, their sharp vests and slicked-back hair glinting in the dim light as they poured strong drinks for the eclectic mix of patrons. It was a haven for power brokers and lowlifes alike, a place where deals were struck and debts were paid, sometimes in blood. The doorway darkened, and the energy in the room shifted. Johnny Hammer Volcano filled the narrow doorway, his towering silhouette instantly commanding attention. His massive frame, supported by a cane, moved with deliberate, labored steps. The injuries he had sustained in recent months were evident in his hunched posture and the grimace that flickered across his face, but Hammer's presence still exuded raw, untamed power. The air seemed to thrum with tension as his cold, dark eyes scanned the room. Some patrons glanced away, their fear betraying them. Others met his gaze with thinly veiled defiance, the kind of bravado only fueled by liquid courage. Hammer ignored them all, his focus narrowing as a hand raised in the far corner of the room. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a signal. Hammer charted a slow course through the tables, each step deliberate, his cane tapping against the polished wood floor like a war drum. The crowd parted for him instinctively, as if the sheer force of his presence demanded it. The corner booth was dimly lit, shrouded in shadows. Ronnie and Reggie Kelly sat opposite one another, their sharp suits tailored to perfection, but their hardened expressions betrayed lives of crime and violence. At the far end of the booth, almost blending into the gloom, sat William Billy Fletcher, his pale, predatory face set in a mask of cold calculation. Hammer slid into the booth with a grunt, his bulk shoving the table forward as the leather-wrapped seat creaked under his weight. His cane clattered against the wall, and he leaned back, his dark eyes scanning the faces before him. "Well?" he barked, his voice like gravel underfoot. Reggie's lip curled in frustration, and he opened his mouth to speak, but Fletcher's growl silenced him. "Quiet." Reggie looked to Ronnie, seeking support, but his older brother merely shook his head. Fletcher leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Gentlemen, we all know what this is. We are not friends, and we are not allies. But if any of us want to grow our enterprises, capitalize on the opportunities left by Carlucci's absence, we cannot allow obstacles to persist." Hammer's fist crashed down on the table, rattling the glasses and cutting Fletcher off. "Cut the act, Billy," Hammer sneered. "I remember when you hopped to and asked, 'How high?'" Whenever Salvatore gave the word, the two men locked eyes, the air between them crackling with animosity. After a tense moment, Fletcher broke the stare, turning his focus to the Kelly brothers. "Garwood is our problem," he said coldly, his voice a low rasp. "None of us can move forward while he's still breathing. We deal with him first, then we deal with each other." Reluctantly, the brothers nodded, their faces darkening at the mention of Garwood's name. "I've got the key to this puzzle," Fletcher continued. "I'll deal with him, but I'll need your help and your men, 3 each, stone-cold killers." Reggie opened his mouth to protest, but Ronnie raised a hand, silencing him. "We'll send 3 of our best," Ronnie said. "Men who worked for our father. You'll get them tomorrow." Hammer laughed darkly. "Stone-cold killers, huh? I'll send 3 of Salvatore's finest. They're loyal to me, and they've got scores to settle." Fletcher nodded, satisfied. "Good. Tomorrow night at the lumberyard. Once I start, don't interfere. This is my plan." The 4 men rose from their seats, throwing wads of cash onto the table. They filed out of the Crescent Club, one by one, disappearing into the foggy night. The damp March air clung to the streets, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Spring was coming, but the city's renewal was overshadowed by the growing darkness in its soul. As they parted ways, the glow of a street lamp illuminated a lone figure emerging from the shadows. Marshall Hayes, his face lined with years of violence and grit, watched from the corner. The sleeve of his overcoat hung empty, a silent testament to his sacrifices. Lighting a cigar, Hayes exhaled a plume of smoke, his frown deepening. He stepped into the fog, his footsteps soft but purposeful as he followed Fletcher's retreating figure. The light from the cigar glowed faintly in the gloom, a solitary ember against the encroaching darkness of Kansas City's violent heart. As the would-be rulers of the city's underbelly chart their course through the night, their minds linger on one man. Hammer murmurs to himself as he limps down the street. Garwood, that name, that face, that look in his eyes every time he shuts down one of us like he is the savior of Kansas City. He's not a man. He's a thorn in my side, a constant reminder of everything Salvatore built and everything I've failed to reclaim. That night in the pen. The way he stood there, guns blazing, righteous fury in his eyes like he thought he was untouchable. Well, he's not. Nobody is. He cost me men, blood, and power, and he made me look weak. Me, Johnny Volcano. He thinks he can walk all over this city, thinks he can carry that badge and stand above us. No. I'll see him broken. I'll see him beg. When it's over, he'll know exactly what happens when you cross me. I am the hammer Fletcher seethed beneath the brim of his hat as he walked. Garwood. Damn him and his unyielding morals, his unwavering self-righteousness. He doesn't see it, does he? That this city is beyond saving, that the rot runs too deep. He can't stop it. But still he fights. Still, he makes a mockery of men like me, men who understand how the world works. He doesn't follow orders. He doesn't respect the chain of command. He's a loose cannon, a liability, and now he's my obstacle. But I'll deal with him. I know his weakness, his need to be the hero. Heroes are easy to destroy because they always think they can win. Well, I'll show him. When I'm through, there won't be a trace of him left in Kansas City. As Ronnie walks beside his brother, his thoughts also turn to Garwood. He thinks he's better than us, thinks he's got the right to step into our business and tear it down. He doesn't understand what we've built, what we've fought for. My father worked his whole life to carve out a piece of this city, and Garwood thinks he can just take it away piece by piece. The men he's put in the ground, the businesses he's destroyed, it's personal now. This city belongs to men like us, not to self-righteous lawmen who think they're untouchable. But everyone bleeds, everyone breaks. And Garwood? His time's coming. Reggie breaks the silence of his brother's thoughts as he speaks his own out loud. That bastard Garwood. Every time I think about him, I feel Dad's rage burn hotter. What would he think if he could see us now? He's cost us too much, too many good men dead, too many deals ruined. And for what? His warped sense of justice. He doesn't understand what it takes to survive in this city. He doesn't understand the blood and sweat we've poured into making a name for ourselves. He thinks he's better than us, but he's just another dog chasing his tail. When this is done, when he's 6 feet under, this city will finally be free of him. The city was restless, and its hunger for blood had not yet been sated. Hayes followed Fletcher, keeping to the shadows, unaware of his quarry's silent ruminations. The grizzled, battle-hardened man stalked Fletcher through the city until the former captain approached a small house on the corner of a block. Hayes spit the stump of his cigar into the street as he watched Fletcher knock softly at the door. Hayes noted the address in his mind for reporting back to Garwood, but he could not see who had opened the door in the darkness, and he was too far away to hear the words exchanged. The time for his meeting with Garwood was drawing close, and without waiting to witness the end of the interaction between Fletcher and the unknown person standing in the shadowed doorway, Hayes turned and vanished into the fog and darkness. Thaddeus Gerard sat at the small, worn kitchen table of his Aunt Celeste and Uncle Andrew's modest home. The faint glow of dying embers in the hearth cast flickering shadows across the room, their light barely touching the edges of the darkened space. The ticking of the clock on the far wall was the only sound accompanying his restless thoughts. His ribs, still tender from the gunshot wound inflicted by Hammer's revolver, throbbed faintly as he shifted in his chair, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate the ache. I should have never left the farm, he thought bitterly, his fingers tracing absent patterns in the grain of the table. The memories of his childhood, filled with the rhythm of planting and harvest, now seemed like a sanctuary he had foolishly abandoned. He had fled the small, suffocating life in search of something greater, only to find himself entangled in a city that felt like it was swallowing him whole. Kansas City, with its shadows and secrets, had stolen the naivety of his youth and replaced it with a growing bitterness. He glanced toward the dim hearth, its glow a pale imitation of the warmth and safety he once knew. He longed, almost desperately, for the simplicity of his parents' farm. There, the world had been smaller, his worries no bigger than the blisters on his hands from a long day's work. But now, he carried burdens he couldn't lay down, wounds not just on his body, but deep within his spirit. And then there was Olivia. Was I a fool, he wondered, his thoughts tumbling back to her. Those fleeting moments with her, the shy conversations, the stolen glances, the way her laughter seemed to light up a room, had they ever truly meant anything? Or had he merely crafted an illusion, a dream of connection to soothe the ache of loneliness? The months that had passed since their last encounter had tempered his passion, replacing it with a darker, heavier emotion. A growing resentment burned low and steady, not at Olivia, but at the man who kept her hidden. Garwood. The name echoed in his mind, heavy with frustration and a bitterness he couldn't shake. Why does he get to decide? Why does he hold all the answers while I'm left in the dark? The soft rap of knuckles on the door snapped him out of his brooding. Thaddeus straightened in his chair, his heart giving a startled thump. The hour was late, and it wasn't often that visitors came unannounced. Rising carefully, mindful of his healing ribs, he moved softly across the floor, not wanting to disturb his aunt and uncle, who were surely asleep in the back room. He hesitated as his hand reached the doorknob, his nerves taut. The shadows beyond the curtained window seemed darker than usual, and a cold tendril of unease coiled in his stomach. With a steadying breath, he opened the door, and the figure that greeted him sent a jolt of uncertainty through his veins. The man on the porch was tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette framed by the faint moonlight filtering through the thin layer of fog that clung to the city streets. He wore a sharp overcoat, impeccably tailored, and a fedora that shadowed much of his face. But even in the dim light, his eyes gleamed with a sharp, piercing intensity that made Thaddeus take a step back. "Thaddeus Gerard?" the man asked, his voice smooth, steady, and unnervingly calm. Thaddeus swallowed hard, his mind racing. "Yes, I'm Thaddeus. Do I know you?" His voice betrayed his uncertainty as he glanced nervously over the man's shoulder, scanning the empty street. The man smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "No, not yet," he replied, "but I've been watching you. You've caught my interest." The words sent a chill through Thaddeus. He gripped the doorframe tighter, his pulse quickening. "What do you want?" he asked cautiously, his voice low. The man stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden porch. "Nothing sinister, I assure you," he said, the hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm here to offer you an opportunity, Thaddeus, a chance to find the answers you've been searching for." "Answers?" Thaddeus repeated, his voice faltering. I don't know what you're talking about." The man tilted his head, his gaze sharpening. "Oh, I think you do. Olivia Parkhurst. Ring any bells?" He let the name hang in the cold night air, watching as the recognition flared in Thaddeus's eyes. "You've been searching for her, haven't you? Wondering where she is, why Garwood keeps her hidden from you. I can help you find her, Thaddeus. I can take you to her." Thaddeus's heart leapt at the mention of Olivia, but suspicion quickly followed. "Why would you help me?" he asked, his voice sharpening. "Who are you?" The man's smirk deepened, his face a mask of confidence and control. "Fletcher," he said simply, his name carrying an air of finality. "And let's just say I have my reasons that align with your desire to see Olivia again." He leaned slightly forward, his presence pressing into the small space between them. "I've heard about the young man who ran himself ragged trying to help a certain young lady in her time of need. Admirable, really. The kind of devotion that can make a man do foolish things or brave things." Thaddeus felt the blood drain from his face. His thoughts raced back to Olivia, to the whirlwind of danger and bloodshed that had engulfed his life since meeting her. His mind screamed for him to shut the door, to send this stranger away and retreat back into the quiet simplicity of the kitchen, but his feet remained planted. Thaddeus's stomach churned as he stared at Fletcher, a man who seemed to carry shadows with him. The promise of seeing Olivia again was intoxicating, but the price of Fletcher's help was still unclear. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Fletcher's smile widened. "Oh, not much," he said, his tone smooth and persuasive. "Just a little information, nothing dangerous for you. You've been close to Garwood. You've seen things, heard things. Share what you know with me, and I'll give you what you want, Olivia." The name, spoken so plainly, made Thaddeus's chest tighten. He glanced back into the dim kitchen, the dying embers now barely more than a glow. Everything in him screamed to close the door, to walk away. But the promise lingered in the air, Fletcher's words wrapping around his resolve and tugging it apart. Fletcher's voice dropped to a conspiratorial tone. "Just a small task, something you're perfectly equipped for. You see, you have access to Garwood's world in a way few others do. You've seen his secrets, the cracks in his armor. All I ask is that you share them with me." The room seemed to tilt as Thaddeus stared at Fletcher, the weight of the proposition pressing down on him like a physical force. He knew the man before him was dangerous, a serpent in human form. But Fletcher's words ignited something inside him, a bitter cocktail of longing, frustration, and the faintest glimmer of hope. "Why should I trust you?" Thaddeus asked, his voice low but steady. "You don't have to trust me," Fletcher said, his tone smooth and persuasive. "But trust yourself, Thaddeus. Trust that this is your chance to finally get the answers you've been searching for." Thaddeus nodded slowly, his voice hollow as he responded. "Fine, but if you're lying—" "I don't lie, Thaddeus," Fletcher interrupted, his smile sharpening. "You'll see soon enough." Detective Beauregard Tecumseh Garwood paced the confines of his dimly lit apartment, the worn floorboards groaning under the weight of his heavy, deliberate steps. The dim light of the single desk lamp cast long shadows on the walls, dancing like the memories and doubts that plagued his mind. His thoughts churned endlessly like the Missouri River, restless and relentless. His gaze flickered to the revolver on the table, its worn grip a reminder of the countless nights he had relied on it. His body bore the marks of those nights, and his soul was equally scarred. Was this plan too bold, too reckless? His life, the lives of his comrades, his family, all hung precariously in the balance. Was it too risky? Could this daring plan outmatch even his hardened resolve? The questions came, unrelenting, but one truth cut through the chaos. If he didn't take the fight to the monsters lurking in the shadows, his family would never be truly safe. The only way out was through. He paused at the window, his gaze fixed on the fog rolling in over the city. The weight of the lives he had taken since swearing to rescue Olivia sat heavy on his chest, like an iron chain that refused to break. He knew that until he tipped the scales, his family, Marie, Katie, Olivia, would never be safe. And if the city's bloodlust demanded more, Garwood would pay the price. He would not stop. Captain Peter Eldridge strode purposefully through the damp streets, the fog clinging to his coat like the doubts weighing on his conscience. His polished shoes struck the cobblestones in rhythmic defiance of his inner turmoil. The weight of his revolver at his hip felt heavier than usual, as if it carried the bullets he hadn't fired that night behind the butcher shop. Bullets that might have saved Cosner from weeks of agony, Hayes from losing his arm, or O'Malley from the LED buried deep in his back. The question gnawed at him. Had it been my fault? The bullets he hadn't fired in the ambush echoed deep in his mind now, hollow reminders of his hesitation. Every step through the fog brought another pang of guilt. If I had fought like Garwood, like Hayes, could it have made the difference? Each breath was a battle against the void pulling at him, the haunting whispers of what could have been. But he swore to himself, as he reached Garwood's apartment, that the next time would be different. Eldridge shook his head, his breath clouding in the cold air. He might never know the answers, but one truth burned within him: he would fight. When the chance came again, there would be no hesitation, no questions. Detective Fitz O'Malley stepped gingerly from a car and stared up at the darkened windows of Garwood's building. His face was pale as he fought to suppress a grimace of pain. Every step was agony. The fragments of lead, lodged deep in his flesh, pressing against raw nerves, sending fiery pain through his body. His breaths were shallow, his lips tight. The doctors had told him the fragments could paralyze him without surgery, but O'Malley had dismissed their warnings. If he had the surgery, or surgeries more likely, he would have been bedridden for months and he had to fight. "If I'm to be crippled, I'd rather it be in the fight," he muttered under his breath as he gripped the cold metal railing of the stairs. Each step upward was a fresh torment, but he pushed through, teeth clenched against the pain. The climb was torture, but O'Malley refused to yield. Every step forward brought him closer to the man he would stand with, no matter the cost. When he reached Garwood's door, he allowed himself a moment to steady his breath. Whatever came next, he would face it standing alongside the men he trusted above all others. Officer Cosner Davis sat in the corner booth of a small diner, watching the fog roll through the streets. His coffee had long gone cold, but he hadn't noticed. His mind wandered through a labyrinth of guilt and regret. He couldn't shake the thought if I hadn't jumped creepy. But if I hadn't gotten that information out of him, would things have turned out differently? The memory of the ambush replayed in his mind, every decision he'd made cutting deeper into his conscience. His thoughts were now fixed on what lay ahead. "Cosner," Roseanne's voice broke through his spiral of self-recrimination, her tone gentle yet pleading. "Don't go. Stay here. Walk me home when my shift ends. You're not even fully healed yet." Her eyes shone with concern. Her hand found his, warm and soft, a lifeline in the storm of his thoughts. He met her eyes and offered a sad smile. "There's nothing I'd like more, but what kind of man would I be if I let others fight my battles? It's not your fight," she said, her voice trembling. "You're only 2 weeks out of the hospital. Please." Cosner stood. "I know," he replied. "I can't explain it now, but someday I will." Their fingers lingered as he rose, her touch a bittersweet reminder of what he might not live to return to. Without another word, he turned and walked out into the fog-drenched night, leaving her alone with her doubts. A short time later, Hayes, Garwood, O'Malley, Eldridge, and Cosner sat in Garwood's apartment, the room heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. Their faces solemn as the weight of the night pressed heavily upon them. The lamp's dim glow did little to push back the shadows, and they spoke in hushed tones, as if the darkness itself had ears. The room was thick with tension, each man bearing his own scars, visible and invisible, from the battles that had brought them to this point. A sudden knock at the door startled them all. Garwood moved to answer it without hesitation, his movements deliberate. The others instinctively reached for their sidearms, their nerves taut. Garwood moved with an air of calm as he opened the door. Garwood's broad frame filled the doorway, momentarily blocking their view of the visitor. When he stepped aside, a tall, imposing man entered, his resemblance to Garwood unmistakable. Eldridge's eyes darted between them, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. "My friends," Garwood said, his voice steady, "you know I am a man of secrets. Tonight you will meet another one of those secrets. Allow me to introduce my brother, Augusta Garwood. He is here to help us with whatever lies ahead." Augusta smiled. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth but firm as he extended his hand. "The pleasure's mine." With introductions complete and plans laid bare, the men rose, their faces grim with resolve, their determination solidifying in the dim light. Garwood's voice broke the silence. "Whatever happens tonight, none of you owe me anything, but I owe each of you more than I can ever repay. Tonight, we tip the scales of justice. With any luck, we'll see the sunrise, and this city will be a little safer for it." With those words, he turned toward the door, his shoulders squared. One by one, the others followed. Garwood led them down the stairs, their steps firm as they walked toward whatever awaited in the shadows. Each man carried his own burdens, his own fears, but together, they stepped into the darkened streets of Kansas City, ready to fight for a city that might never be saved. The building's door creaked shut behind them, sealing the faint warmth of the apartment away, as Detective Beauregard Tecumseh Garwood led his ragged band into the mist-veiled streets of Kansas City. The city seemed to hold its breath, the heavy fog swallowing the sound of their footsteps and cloaking the flicker of gaslights. Shadows danced on the brick walls, twisting and distorting into grotesque shapes as if the city itself were alive, watching, waiting. Each man moved with purpose, Garwood's broad shoulders cutting through the gloom, Augusta's silent resolve like a specter at his side, O'Malley gritting his teeth against every painful step. Hayes clutched his revolver. Steeled against the calming storm with the steadiness of the old warhorse he was, and Cosner's youthful fire burning in his eyes, purpose and courage waxing strong against his doubt and guilt. Eldridge moved with a purpose as he swore not to let these men down for a second time. Somewhere beyond the veil of night, danger stirred, a predator lurking in the depths of Kansas City's dark soul. As they vanished into the fog, their silhouettes swallowed by the shadows, it wasn't just the city they faced, it was the weight of their choices, the echoes of their pasts, and the uncertain promise of the battle to come. In the distance, a church bell tolled, each chime cutting through the silence like a harbinger of the blood that would stain the streets before the night was through.